Hi, my name is Sophie Edwards. I'm calling in on behalf of Four Elements Living Arts based on Manitoulin Island. And so I want to start first by thanking all of you for being part of this important symposium. For those of us that have been working out in the sector up here for a long time, saying these sorts of things in our various ways, it's really great to have key people from key funding organizations together to listen to our needs and to work together to come up with some solutions that work for us in the North. And so I also want to thank Jude, who's been working so hard for us on our behalf and bringing people together, because sometimes on our own what we say doesn't get across, but when we do it together. So thank you, Jude, for bringing everybody together and having our back for so long. One of the issues we face in rural Northern Ontario, I'll speak mostly about rural organizations, although I suspect it's the same for urban organizations in the North, is access to funding, and of course that's across the board everywhere. However, we have some gaps and some barriers that might be different in our region than in urban areas and in southern areas. So while an organization in a southern rural area might be able to access local funding through businesses, through sponsorships, and also through municipalities, because the municipalities have the budgets to be able to do that, that is not something we can access. For instance, I was once, it was suggested that an equivalent rural organization was able to access $35,000 from their municipal budget as a yearly stipend to support arts in the community. And I was told that that's a good way to begin our process to be able to support what we're doing, and then the second step would be to apply for core funding through the Ontario Arts Council. However, in our municipality, which is similar across the board in the North, our municipalities just don't have the tax base to be able to make that kind of funding. This year we made an application to the council for $300 to be able to support our program, and we did not receive that. The maximum they give out is $100. So many of the models for funding means that it's structured in such a way that we need to be able to have support from our municipalities or from local businesses to be able to have a larger portfolio, so then we can apply for funding from other agencies like the Ontario Arts Council for core funding and this sort of thing. But we just don't have that base. We don't have the tax base, and we don't have the large economic infrastructure to be able to get funding from large industries as sponsors. So our local resources, financial resources, are quite limited, which means we have that limit to be able to apply for other funding, like core funding from other areas, from other funders. And then funders will look at us and think that we don't have the capacity, or that we're not established. However, we are established, we just don't have that funding base. So we need to think about how can we create either a weighted judging system when rural and northern organizations are applying into the same grouping as other organizations from the south that have access to resources we don't. Perhaps it's a weighted judging or grading system, or there's a fund for, even though we may not necessarily be emerging in our capacity or emerging in the programs we offer, but emerging in terms of the economic infrastructure. So we need to think, that's one of the key areas I think we need to consider. And maybe there's a partnership between various funding agencies to be able to respond to that gap. So that for us, that's a key issue, is to be able to develop our economic portfolio when we have very limited resources to do so. Another thing that we deal with is access. As some of you have realized by traveling through the North, it's an incredibly large geographical area. So not only do our programs have to service a large catchment area, it also means your organizations have to service a large catchment area. And what often happens is that organizations will decide to bring programs into the North, and they hit mostly the urban communities. And the representatives or the workshops are in those urban communities, and our people out in the regions can't get to them because it is a distance to travel. So it's time. And many of the artists in the North are not just artists full time. They're running other jobs to be able to do what they're doing. Even myself, working with Four Elements, I have other work that I do to be able to support my work with Four Elements, and that's the case for many artists in the North. So it's time to be able to actually get to these meetings and away from families on weekends and evenings. That's difficult. And winter is an issue for traveling during the winter with road closures or snow or anything else. So we tend not to get out, and the representatives tend not to get to us. So that's an issue to think about, and and I know later in the workshop there'll be some discussion about strategies, but I won't be part of that necessarily, so I'm going to make a pitch for a couple of ideas. Is that one of the things I've done a lot of thinking about, and I think would make sense for our region, is rather than having one representative in an urban community like Sudbury, Sault Ste. Marie, Thunder Bay, whereas those they have been very helpful and important, but to consider, rather than having one person, to take the funding, say it's $100,000, to have one person supported in say, Sault Ste. Marie, for the salaries and the offices and the travel time and everything else, is to put that money, divide it up between, say, 4 key communities where there are people working in that community, either organizations or leaders that are supporting the communities. They're helping artists write grants. They're teaching them about the Arts Council and other funding streams that are available. They're running workshops. They're doing all this sort of work on behalf, effectively, on these various organizations without support to be able to do that work. So if we had a network of representatives or agents in various communities, some monies could be put to each of them to support them to do their work, and then have training and capacity development for those people. And so they're networked together, they're getting the training so that they know what the funding programs are, what the various project streams are, who's out there, what the resources are, and they know how to communicate this. So their skills are developed, and then they spread that out into their communities. Because the chances are, and this is the way it's happening, if somebody knows I'm here in this community, they're going to contact me prior to contacting somebody in Sudbury or Thunder Bay or Sault Ste. Marie, because first of all, they know who I am. Second, they've seen the work we do, and there's that kind of communication that happens, in relationship building and mentorship that naturally happens in a local area. So are there ways that we can think about networking people through the North for training, capacity development, and funding to support what they're doing in our communities? Because this is really important work, and even though Fort Almonte isn't funded to do it, we're not going to not do it. So we spend a lot of our time doing capacity development in our areas, and support and training and that sort of thing, which we're not really supported to do. And so let's talk about how we can create networks and support each other in doing that, and spread some of that funding around to support us in our various communities. Something we can talk about as well, or that I'm sure will come up over the weekend during the discussions, is the culture of the North. I mentioned already about our geographical area, but it's not just that. It's about how we do things. We are not, models that work in Southern Ontario don't necessarily work here, not just because of geographical distances, but because who we are culturally and socially and historically, and we have different ways of doing things. And a big part of what's important for the funders and the people moving into the North, coming into the North, and organizations that want to come and work here, is understanding and spending time in that relationship building to understand and listen to us about how we do things, and how we define ourselves, and how we define our art, and what we value in our work, and what our aesthetic is. In Southern Ontario or in urban areas, conceptual art is an aesthetic that is really valued. And it's not that it's not valued here, but many of us are working in a landscape tradition. We may be pushing the edges of it. We're doing work that engages questions of landscape. We're engaged in things that are culturally traditional, or bringing together our contemporary time frame with more historical contexts. And so it's important to think about how we define ourselves. One of the things that we've learned in our work through Four Elements, and I hear this in many, not just with art organizations, but smaller organizations in the North, is that we really have to, we have to multitask. And we have to develop organizations that are multi-purpose. So our spaces need to be multi-purpose. Our organizations do multiple things, just like the people who work in them. We may not all have one particular job, and that's different than in urban communities, where you might be able to get an arts job and be a full-time artist, or a full-time arts administrator. In the North, that's not the way it is. Most of us have jobs. There's multiple jobs, and so it's not. It's about that context, but it's also about developing organizations that are more resilient in the north and respond to multiple needs and are more streamlined. So how can we work between various funding agencies and models so that we might be working with, you know, an organization that does some element of farming, for instance, and arts development, or some sort of a business and arts organizing. So looking at how can we develop a model for the north where various funders and various programs could work together to support organizations to partner together or to meet multiple needs. And over the last number of years, working with 4 Elements, as we became more known as an organization to which organizations from urban and southern groups could come into the north to work, I received many contacts from organizations wanting to work with us to come into the north to deliver programs. And there's funding out there for organizations to do that. And it's great that organizations want to get into the north. However, there are a couple of issues that need to be addressed in the funding, in the model, and in the funding requirements for those organizations. First, we have found, and I'm sure other organizations have found, that the best way for those partnerships to develop is over time, so that they're not quick projects, that they spend the time to build a relationship with us so that they know who we are and know how we work, so that those programs are designed to work with us in the north and aren't just fit from an existing program and move into the north. Another key thing is resources. So organizations are coming into the north and they're accessing funding from various agencies to deliver programs in the north. So in some sense it's responding to a need for programming in the north. However, it's supporting southern organizations to do that, and the funding is going to the south. A small percentage of that funding comes into our communities. We may access some fantastic programs. However, in the north, we have to partner with those organizations and support them, but we may not get the funding to do that. A small percentage of their budgets might be there, but not necessarily. So we end up volunteering through our organizations because our organizations don't have the economic capacity. We have the organizational capacity, we have the skills and the training and those sorts of things to be able to support them. But they might come in, and it's difficult for us in the north to see organizations come in that might have a $60,000, $100,000, $200,000 budget to run programs over 1 to 3 years, and a very small percentage of that is coming into our communities or staying in the communities. Most of it is going to the artists from other southern organizations. So I'm not against these sorts of programs. They're great programs, but I think funders need to make sure that their application programs and those budgets include funding, budget amounts in them to support the local organizations to act as a host.